Alright, today we're going to take a step back a little bit and go through some of the early history of psychology. We're going to talk about the first four bullets here: the early roots of psychology, early frameworks, which is structuralism and functionalism, the psychodynamic perspective, and behavioral perspective. We'll watch a few movies at the end as well, or clips. So I'll take the first couple of seconds. I won't speak. You can read through the notes and fill them in corresponding to your sheet. So the early roots of psychology. From approximately 600 to 300 BC, Greek philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle conjectured on topics seen in psychology today, such as pleasure, pain, knowledge, motivation, rationality, and mental illness. Why do we have these things? How do they play out in our everyday lives, and why do they exist, really? In the 1600s, French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes theorized that the body and mind are separate entities, a concept that became known as dualism. Dualism was largely ruled out, though. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke were English philosophers from the 17th century who disagreed with the concept of dualism, arguing that the sensations, images, thoughts, and feelings are physical processes that occur within the brain. The first use of the term psychology is often attributed to the German scholastic philosopher Rudolf Göckel in 1590. However, the term did not come into popular usage until the German philosopher Christian Wolff popularized it between 1732 and 1734. Psychology was largely a branch of philosophy until the mid-1800s, when it developed as an independent scientific discipline in Germany and in the United States. They started realizing the usefulness of it and that it was very, very different from philosophy that had some actual practical applications. So the early framework, structuralism and functionalism. The late 19th century marks the start of psychology as a scientific enterprise. Wilhelm Wundt, often considered the founder of psychology, founded the first laboratory dedicated exclusively to psychological research in 1879. Edward B. Titchener studied under Wundt and expanded upon Wundt's ideas to found the theory of structuralism. Structuralism attempted to understand the mind as the sum of varying underlying parts, classifying the structures of the mind much like chemists classify the elements of nature into the periodic table. Functionalism was founded by William James as an alternative to structuralism. This focused more on attention on the functions of the mind and the ways in which the mind adapts to changing situations and environments. More what we know of psychology like today than any kind of structural system. And then we get into the psychodynamic perspective that was popularized by one of the most famous psychologists, Sigmund Freud, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The psychodynamic perspective focuses on the dynamic relations between the conscious and the unconscious mind and how these psychological forces might relate to early childhood experiences. He was a big believer in that kind of everything that goes on in our adult lives is a direct result of what's happened to us in our childhood lives. Psychodynamics originated with Sigmund Freud in the late 19th century, who suggested that psychological processes are flows of psychological energy, the libido, in a complex brain. Freud's theory of psychoanalysis holds two major assumptions. One, that much of mental life is unconscious, that we don't actually know what our brains are processing, and that it's kind of almost in the back of our head kind of thing. And two, that past experiences, especially in early childhood, shape how a person feels and behaves throughout the rest of their life. Freud's structural model of personality divides the personality into three parts. You've got the id, the ego, and the superego. When these parts are in conflict, an imbalance occurs in the form of psychological distress. So this is his view. It's largely been disproven, but a lot of his theories, his underlying premises are correct and what we still use in psychology today. Carl Jung expanded upon Freud's theories, introducing the concepts of the archetype, the collective unconscious, and individuation. Most psychodynamic approaches center around using talk therapy to examine maladaptive functions that developed early in life and are, at least in part, unconscious. So again, a lot of the psychodynamic perspective is still in use today. Talk therapy is one of the biggest parts of psychology. And this is a model of the id, ego, and superego. According to Freud's structural model, the personality is divided into these three parts. The portion above the water signifies our conscious mind. This is what we know is going on in our mind, but as you can see, it's the smallest part of the iceberg. The portion below the water illustrates the unconscious mind. All that's going on in our mind is processing that we don't actually know, but what really makes us who we are. And then we get into the behavioral perspective. We'll have a few clips at the end of this. So behaviorism emerged in the early 20th century as a reaction to mentalistic psychology, such as the psychoanalytic theory of the time, which focuses on inner states rather than observable behaviors. They say, well, there's certain things that people are doing, we can observe those, why are those happening? The primary tenet of behaviorism is that psychology should concern itself with the observable behavior of people and animals, not with the unobservable events that take place in their minds. How can we change the actions of people? Not worry about what's going on in their unconscious mind, which they themselves can't see. The Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov is widely known for describing the phenomenon now known as classical conditioning in his experiments with dogs. You may have heard of this. Ivan Pavlov is actually a scientist, and he hated psychology. He didn't consider himself a psychologist at all and would fire people who called him a psychologist. But he was studying the digestive tract, or the digestive system of dogs. He'd ring a bell to feed them, and he realized that as he was ringing the bell, dogs would just automatically salivate, even if there wasn't food in front of them. So we got this classical conditioning. Take a quick look at a clip from the show The Office that does a pretty good job of explaining this.
Another file. Gonna have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid? What do you think? In school, we learned about this scientist who trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by feeding them whenever a bell rang. So for the past couple weeks, I've been conducting a similar experiment. Dwight, one Altoid? Okay. Altoid? Sure. Input? Input? Yes. What are you doing? What? I don't know. My mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
Alright, going back to the slideshow. We'll just look at it here. The Edward Lee Thorndike was an American psychologist whose work on animal behavior and the learning process led him to discover the law of effect. John B. Watson was an American psychologist who is best known for his classical conditioning experiment using little Albert, in which he conditioned a baby to fear soft white rabbits. And we'll see an example. We'll actually see the experiment itself. It's kind of messed up stuff.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats.
Found it.
Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats, whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
I think that would creep anybody out. But nonetheless, pretty sick stuff. And then finally, B.F. Skinner coined the term operant conditioning, in which a voluntary response is strengthened or attenuated depending on its association with positive or negative consequences. If you do something good, you get a reward, you're more likely to do it. You do something bad happens to you, you're less likely to do it. This is our last slide. We can see this in the show, The Big Bang Theory.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Oh, hey, Kim. hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you at work.
Okay. I know what you're doing.
Really?
Yes. You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Very good. Chocolate?
No, I don't want it. Sheldon, you can't train my girlfriend like a lab rat.
Actually, it turns out I can.
Well, you shouldn't.
There's just no pleasing you, is there, Leonard? You weren't happy with my previous approach to dealing with her, so I decided to employ operant conditioning techniques, building on the works of Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. Yet by this time next week, I believe I can have her jumping out of a pool, balancing a beach ball on her nose.
No, this has to stop now.
I'm not suggesting we really make her jump out of a pool. I thought the bazinga was implied. I'm just tweaking her personality, just sanding off the rough edges, if you will.
No, you're not sanding Penny.
Are you saying that I am forbidden from applying a harmless, scientifically valid protocol that will make our lives better?
Yes, you're forbidden.
Bad, Leonard. You know, using positive reinforcement
That's
techniques, I can
basically
train
gives us
that
the
behavior
gist
out
of
of
it.
her.
So that's all for this one.